Hi, my name's Dave. I'm the CEO of a company called Reclamation Games. I started a little while back. We made a prototype of a game for Metroidvania where the main character could travel back and revisit her past. And we thought that'd be kind of interesting for storytelling and as a way of dealing with backtracking in the Metroidvania genre. And since then, I quit my job, went all in on making this game, and it's going to be coming out in Q4 of 2021 on PS5, Xbox Series S and X, Nintendo Switch, and Windows PC via Steam and itch.io. So check it out.
I'm glad you were able to put the game on the Switch. I mean, sometimes indie studios don't have the assets to do that or the manpower to do that out of the gate. They have to wait after a Steam or Xbox PS4 release. So that's great to hear.
Yeah, the Switch was kind of like a lot of Metroidvanias go out on Switch, and we kind of feel like it was a Switch game. So that was the first console we wanted to get locked down. I should also mention, because a lot of people are like, you're coming out on PS5 but not 4, and our plan is to get to that later, but we only do have the manpower to get a certain number of consoles, so
yeah. It's like, not to get too off canter with that, but can you speak a little bit about that? Because we're in a weird game cycle right now with next-gen consoles. People are patching games for the next generation, and you're like one of the first studios that actually, aside from Insomniac, that just released a game for PS5 specifically that doesn't backport to PS4 or PS4 Pro.
Yeah, there's two levels to the reason. One is we're an indie dev and we're poor and short on time and money. So that's like layer one, because everyone's like, why aren't you doing all these things you should do? It's like, yeah, right? The other reason is, so and I can't violate the non-disclosure agreement I have with Sony right now. So I'm going to tiptoe around this by saying, PS5s are kind of hard to find relative to PS4s. They're kind of expensive, and the same pattern is not necessarily true for dev kits.
That's a good answer.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about Rihanna? I'm gonna call her Rihanna. Reina and Jericho.
Yeah.
You mentioned some Metroid style vein. There's platforming aspects. There's backtracking aspects. Talk a little about, and there's also a story-driven narrative.
For me, I think of games very narratively, and so that's kind of had to be in there no matter what. And I felt like there wasn't a Metroidvania game that had like done super tight story, or maybe like super tight plot, because you have games like Hollow Knight where you sort of like piece together these fragments of the story, and it becomes quite strong by the end, but you're really only getting glimpses. And this one is like there's a narrative all throughout. It's integrated into the game mechanics, it's integrated into just the order you go through the events in the game can have impacts on it. It's just all throughout a combination of traditional stuff like cutscenes and all that, and then things you piece together as you find, and you're sort of unraveling the events that happen before the game and trying to impact what happens for the outcome of the game.
No, like I think one of the most difficult things in making a Metroidvania game is the amount of backtracking and the distance of backtracking. Like, how do you know when something is too far or too close for the player to travel to, so it's not a chore, or it's not, what's the word I'm looking for, tedious?
So there's two answers to that. One is just level design. You try to have a tight level, and you just sort of play through it and think like, did I get bored going back for this thing, or did I ask too much? The flip side of it kind of ties into one of our key mechanics, which is this idea of time travel, where Reina has an item that lets her go back to her recent past, and she keeps everything she's collected, but the rest of the world snaps back to how it was. So this lets us do routing that's not just like, it sounds cliche, but it's through time and space. Let's say, Reina takes your wallet is the example I always go with. I'm Reina, I take your wallet, and you say, hey, you took my wallet, give it back. She can now rewind time. She'll still have the wallet, and yours will just wink out of existence because you can't have a copy. And so if there's ever a contradiction in reality, whatever she has trumps reality. And so now you're going to be thinking, oh, where did I put my wallet? I must have lost it. And we lean into that, right? We have cutscenes where things play out differently based on events like that. And so how does that tie into backtracking? Well, you're kind of, by going back, if you're going back, by traveling back through time, the place is maybe how it was, but Reina is different or whatever. And so maybe you're coming back to visit someone, and now you've stolen their wallet. Like we get these weird asymmetries, so that even if you're technically revisiting the exact same place at literally the exact same time, right? Because she's reverted time to the technique from everyone else's point of view. This is the first time she's ever going to see something. It's still different because she's changed, and that is tracked by the game, and it creates like a new potential outcome.
I feel like this has been a discussion in your your virtual office about like how the time travel works and putting nodes together and trying to figure out what happens when this happens and the player does this. Has that happened in your production?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's a mess. And let me tell you, writing save game data for this has been a nightmare, because there's there's reality from Reina's point of view and the things that have happened for her. And then there's at every different save point, because at every save point we snap a version of reality. And so it's like everyone who's dead is dead. Everyone who is alive is alive. If she ever goes back to that save point again, that is how reality will reconfigure. If she gets defeated and respawns, reality reconfigures that way. So we have to track all these different timelines in the game, and it starts to get pretty messy.
Now you said things come back and as reality reshapes based on her time traveling, but the level design still stays the same, or is that procedurally generated?
So there's a couple answers to that. The first is in the story mode, because the game's coming with 3 modes. 2 will be available at launch, and 1 will patch in later when we bring it to other consoles and stuff. Right out of the gate, we have story mode, and that's fixed level design, fixed item placement. It's not procedural at all. It's a very traditional Metroidvania, but with the emphasis on the story. Then we have the speedrun mode, because some people were already speedrunning the demo, and I built it with that in mind. If you play through the demo, which is available on Steam right now, speedrun mode will be patched in whenever I finish it, in theory today. But anyway, if you play through the demo, if you beat the first real boss, there's sort of like a mini boss to teach you a mechanic, and then there's the boss of the first area, and you'll get an item, and most people, when they get it, they're like, oh, this is a speed game. Reina fights with a sword, you get an item that really helps you move around and close the distance, because a big struggle of the early game is they have guns and you have a sword. Closing from 20 feet to 5 feet is a bit of a challenge, right? So because this game was built with speed in mind, we have the speedrun mode. And then lastly, which looping back to your question, we want to build in a randomizer, and that has also been constrained the entire time. So you can scramble the layout of the game, you can scramble the contents of chests and all sorts of things, and it'll be different every time.
It's interesting that you had I want to say the foresight to have a speedrun mode. A lot of indie game studios don't have the time or the budget to do something like that, and there's so many games that benefit from a mode like that.
Yeah, well, again, these are things I enjoy, because the benefit of being an indie is you can sort of start from an artistic point of view, right? You can think, I like these games, I want to make a game like this, and you can do that. We don't have to get to a board and show all right, so markets are showing that they can support this much this, and this is popular, and this increases sales curves. There's a statement I want to make with the game, there's things I want it to do, and we just do it.
Yeah, I think, like you said, that's the advantage of being an indie dev. You don't have to. Of course, you have your milestones in your budget, and you have to maintain that. But at the same time, you can do whatever you want to do without having to go through a bureaucracy of bullshit. There's another way to put it. If you want to change something or tweak something, or and it can be very minor. I know people who work at AAA studios that it used to be they could just make a quick change. Now they have to put in a request, and the request can take 2 or 3 days, and it takes forever.
Yeah. And a lot of work goes into just things like permission. And for something like us, especially because we had speedrunning as a constraint and the randomizer as a constraint, we want to do this. So it's such a tiny detail that most people will never notice, but every room in the game can be bounded with a rectangle, and it never overlaps another room. Most players will never notice that, and it's a tiny detail, but it makes rearranging the rooms really, really easy if you build with that constraint in mind right from the beginning. So it's a little tiny detail, and if you do it, it will save you so much time, because the problem with scrambling the rooms becomes a lot easier.
So let's talk about the narrative of your game, because you do have a story mode. What's going on in this world with Jericho and Reina?
All right. That's part of the problem. Reina has no idea. I'll give you a mild spoiler in that. So Reina has this item that lets her travel back to her recent past. The initial impulse for the game, which you find out it happens right before the game starts, is it's given to her by Jericho, and he is abducted and taken away, and she's going after him to try rescuing him. She doesn't know what this thing does. And the reason is because Jericho's the last one who has it, and one of his final acts was traveling back into his past from a future where Reina and he had gone and done many other things. He's traveled back to before she knows about any of that. He gets into trouble, hands it off to her. So now we have a version of Reina who has no idea what's going on. He's just randomly abducted by who? She has no idea, and she has to figure this out. And she doesn't even know that she's carrying like the most valuable thing in the world is this necklace she's carrying. She has no idea what it does and starts unraveling it as the game goes on. But yeah, I don't want to share too much about the plot because a big point of it is, yeah, she has no clue, is immediately way out of her depth, and is overmatched in every way. She's not, this isn't, Arnold Schwarzenegger from a 90s action movie where it's like, okay, at the very least, he could beat anyone up. It's like, she can't beat anyone up. She doesn't know how to fight. She doesn't know how to do anything. She doesn't know what's going on. She's competent and scrappy and moves well. And that's the only advantage. And after that, it's like, okay, you got to start finding things so that you're not going to get your butt kicked in every single fight. You got to find out the truth of what's going on. You got to find out who you can trust. And yeah, she's building all of that up from ground zero.
What made you guys decide to go for? You guys went with a 2D perspective, but the game is inherently 3D and 3D models. What made you decide that over, pixel art or a more an animated style?
We considered an animated style, and that was actually the original plan, but it's largely based on skill sets. Like, yeah, we're a super small studio. I'm the only dev, and we've contracted out, like there's a guy named Dan Eater who's doing our 3D character models, a guy named Leandro Franci who's doing our character portraits and stuff, but it's like, we made a game based on the sort of game we could make. And a lot of people think like, oh, I'm gonna do pixel art because that'll be easier. But it's like, you better be a pretty good drawer. Like, it's an entire set of skill, and to a certain extent I think it's harder. A lot depends on maybe your dispositions and your skills and everything. If you are a kid who is always a legendary artist and you have practice with pixel art and you're exposed to those sorts of games, it might be easier for you. But for me, it's like, if I have to change an animation, like if I have to change the main character's walk cycle, you're redrawing every single frame if you do traditional or pixel art. Whereas if it's a 3D model, like you can just move the bones a little bit, and it's way easier to iterate on. So we went that way largely out of necessity.
So play to your strengths basically is what you're telling people to do, especially if they're a really small indie team.
Yeah, and even then, it's like, it's not like this was like a negative compromise or whatever, right? It's just that like there's strengths of all of these approaches, but we're not explicitly trying to be a retro game. And we were inspired by things like the aesthetic of a game like Overwatch. So okay, that's already nudging us towards 3D models, and then it's like, all right, and they're easier to work with. Like, all right. And we took a look at Dan's work, and it was like, okay, we really want to work with him. I really like the 3D work he does. It's like, all right, then that's 100% what we're doing.
It's as the sole dev of your studio, with technology always evolving and changing, with like RTX and Unity and Unreal, and the support for those systems continues to grow and thrive. What's it like making a game? Like I said, you're not solo, but like you have contractors and help that you freelance out, but it's mainly you. Like, what's it like? Is it good when technologies are evolving this fast, or does it hinder someone like you when stuff is changing so rapidly? If you get a new update for Unity or Unreal or the new RTX cards and all that stuff.
It definitely throws a wrench into things. So for example, like we had a big reveal that we were coming to PS5 a little while ago. And there was an update to the Unity render pipeline we were using right away, which trashed, like days before I was going to cut the trail, it trashed the aesthetics for the entire game. And so it was just a mad dash of like, and for the record, when this happens in Unity, everything turns purple. It's like everything. And it's not like shaded purple. It's just like solid magenta. The red value cranked to full, the blue value cranked to full. And it's like, that's what the game looked like. And we had the trailer due in, I think it was 3 days. I'd already written an article for PlayStation blog and everything. It's like, all right, how are we going to get out of this one? And we just did a mad dash. Like, we'll get anything. Like, we just have to get it looking like a video game. And, that happened. So... yeah, sometimes you get burned with stuff like that where we have to do the update. We can't feasibly roll back and we just are going to have to roll with it. And then, yeah, some people are like, these graphics look like they were hastily assembled. It's like, well, let me tell you, they weren't, and then they were. As far as overall, like, change of technology pace, I may be in the minority where I think, like, most technological innovation is, like, not super relevant. Like, you take a game like Celeste that came out 4 years ago, I think. It's a fantastic game. It looks like it was made in the early 90s, but it's still a good game, so that's all right. Yeah, and my favorite Zelda game is Breath of the Wild. My second favorite one is Wind Waker, and again, that game's 20 years old or so, and it's like, it still looks good. So, you don't necessarily have to play the game of, I'm racing against technology, I'm going to be on the cutting edge the entire time. The studios that do that, or even the consoles that do that, there's strings attached, right? Like, there's expectations that come with it, and you have to engage in that, and so you're always on the cutting edge. But I don't think that necessarily has to be the case. And even like Among Us was one of the big hits this year, and they're not chasing the cutting edge. They're just, we have an idea for a game, and this is what we're gonna do. And I think for an indie, you probably have to go that way. I can't think of too many indie titles where they were like really going after the cutting edge of visuals, because I think you just need too many staff to do that.
Well, sometimes, and this is a recurrence, like an NVIDIA will reach out to somebody and be like, hey, like, we like your game, like, we want to support ray tracing, here's some funding, can you add a ray tracing to your game? Sometimes they'll do that for indie devs, but it's fairly rare in that situation.
Pass along my info if
NVIDIA,
if it comes up.
You would like funding for ray tracing, please.
Yeah.
That it's interesting, the whole cycles with indie games and development and studios, and like you said, like some of those games like Among Us are a very slow burn. Among Us was out for a couple years before it exploded. I think there's even somewhere with the interview with the creators that like they'd given up on the game, like they were like, it's not going to sell, like move on to the next thing, and then right as they said that, it just literally exploded. It's like even the CEO of Devolver Digital has said like a lot of the games that they produce are a slow burn. Like sometimes they're not immediately successful and they take 2 or 3 years for people to discover them and play them, and it's an interesting cycle to see that because there are so many games that release in Steam every month. I think the statistic is 100 games a week on Steam. So there's a lot of there's just a lot of games. Like they're not bad, they're not good, but there's just so many games. And shuffling through them.
I think part of that is also just you think back to like what the internet was like maybe 10 years ago, where like there'd be a website like Newgrounds where people are making games in Adobe Flash and everything, and people like it was sort of scattered. All of it's sort of consolidated to Steam or like Nintendo Switch or Play. Like these things that would just get thrown on the internet on some website are now just going through the same store as everybody else. So in a sense, the market has expanded, and there's definitely more noise, but it's kind of much like the noise has moved to like one centralized location. So yeah, it's easier to get lost in the shuffle in some ways, but also I'd argue like there's a lot of games that just are really just like, I'm not trying to be derogatory or anything, but like these games were not made to sell 1 million copies or whatever, right? A lot of the time it's like, this is just some like thing I did for school, or this is just these quick things that normally would be on some website. So it's like, the problem is there used to be lots of different pots for all these games to go in, and now we just have a couple huge ones and everything gets thrown in. As far as that affecting the slow burn, I think that's just the nature of the beast, where you have a good game that spreads through word of mouth. And in the case of Among Us, where it's like this highly social game, and a global pandemic, I think, was the big thing, where it's like there's not a ton of like multiplayer games in general aside from a couple specific genres. Like if you don't want to play a game where you're shooting things or League of Legends, your options to have like a casual hangout game with friends like are already very limited, whereas Among Us was basically like this party game, right? So that's just an example of like these conditions sometimes create things. A few years back, it was the single player game is dead, and then Horizon Zero Dawn comes out, Breath of the Wild comes out, and everyone was like, you realize, oh, we've actually been starving people for single player games, and this is what they wanted all along, and now they've blown up again. But I mean, there was a stretch where everyone was like, yeah, it's going to be battle royales, that's the new AAA.
Yeah, I mean, just because I have high opinions about this, it's when people say a single player game is dead, it's not that it's dead, it's just it takes so much more, it takes a lot more work to handcraft a narrative, create characters, create level design if it's not procedurally generated for players to play through, than it is to just make an island and say, okay, everyone kills each other. Like, that's, like, there's so much more work to that genre of game than just balancing out weapon damage statistics, so it becomes difficult, and so, like, it's a long process.
In terms of asset creation, for sure, and yeah, you can see like, yeah, by games getting more graphically focused, right? Like for these studios that are chasing the cutting edge and they need a lot of artists and it takes a lot of time to make these things. Yeah, as the single player becomes less and less scalable in a way, because if it took a week to make a new area in a game, then there'd be no problem with single player games because they typically need more areas, right? You can't just have like 5 different multiplayer maps that are getting cycled through, or like in League of Legends, like it's basically one,
one map, yeah.
Yeah.
They don't even change the visual aesthetic of it. It's always the same because they can't, right? Because people need to identify this area all the time.
And that return on investment is crazy compared to a single player game where they would need like 100 of those. But even if it still only took a week, that's not the end of the world, right? But if it takes, 6 months and you need people from different disciplines, and it's like, oh yeah, one level designer and one artist can't just do that. Like we need everybody. And now, oh, well, we need supervisors to make sure it's like, it gets unmanageable. So I can see why they briefly got biased against it. But I'm a big believer, like there's a way to have your cake and eat it too. And that's the sweet spot for indies. And that's the nice thing they can bring to the table. Cause like, there's the clarity you can get where it's like, we don't care about that, right? I'm not trying to make the greatest looking game of all time, but because of that, I can make a game that's gonna really hit you in the feels hard, because we're not spending all of our time on like, okay, we want it to look this good, but it needs to run on this console, so we need to like make it more and more efficient, so we need all these engineers. It's like, we're not playing that game. We're playing like, I want to give you an experience that will leave a lasting impression on you. And I think like we can do that, especially with the way, we've got a really genuine, heartfelt story about doing difficult things essentially. And yeah, we're not engaged in that AAA struggle in a way, or even just the problems that they're having with single players. We don't have to deal with all of that because like there's just this focus, and everything in the game is serving that.
Yeah, I also think that with modern game development especially, there's been this nasty kind of thing coming into it, which is the game's value is attached to an hourly playtime, which is terrible because it's like, I mean, people always like to judge a game based on how many hours it takes to complete or how short it is, and it's just like, well, I'd hate to break it to you, but like a lot of people can beat old Nintendo games in like 10 minutes, you know what I mean? And those were $80. So like, I think attaching a value to a game based on the hours of playtime is terrible, but that's unfortunately a trend that we're seeing a lot of nowadays.
Yeah, I see why people do that, because ultimately, like, the question is, am I getting value for my money? And I think that's 100% valid. And I'm like very picky about the games I play. Some people will just like buy anything on Steam sale, but it's like on Steam sale, I might get one game or something like that. But yeah, it's not just hours spent, because if you walk up to any person and say like, would you rather have 2 great hours or 8 mediocre ones? It's like, we'll happily choose the 2 hours. And that's basically the trade-off between like going to a job you like for a day or a movie you love, right? It's like, oh, you have to pay me to do one. On the other, I'll give you money for 2 great hours, right? And that's where we're going. Like, because a lot of people are like, if I want 1 hour of gameplay per every dollar I spend. And it's like, we kind of do have that in the back of our minds, right? It's like, okay, our price is not going to be super high. But you get weird things where it's like, how long, people ask me like, how long does it take to complete the game? And it's like, well, I mean, just reading through the script of the game takes 6 hours, but if a speedrunner is skipping every cutscene, it's like they might be probably 90 minutes. Like, I don't know, they can get pretty fast. People can beat Uncharted 1 in something like 40 minutes. So I mean, like, yeah, it's hard to know what playtime means, but it's like, I'm gonna give you something though. That's all we can say is like, you know, really. And the problem with the hourly model is like these games where it's like, yeah, we're gonna do loot boxes and we're gonna go big and we're gonna get lots of hours logged, and it's free. You have to pay if you want your character to look this way, but it's free. We're giving you unlimited value. But fundamentally, they're still trying to like take your money, and like and gamers are disillusioned by it. Like they can feel the monetization scheme a little bit with loot boxes and stuff. They can feel the disingenuity about it. Whereas like, you know, I'm pretty transparent. It's like I have something to give, which like sounds like maybe snooty or whatever, but it's like we have a game, we're gonna sell it, but it is a gift. Like we have, and like we're thinking about speedrunning, we're thinking about randomizing and infinite replayability. We're thinking about all these things, and it's like, you know, there's something coming your way.
Can you talk about when does your game come out, and is it releasing across all platforms simultaneously, or is it going to be kind of segmented out?
So, Reina Jericho is coming out on Windows PC, on Steam and itch.io, PS5, Xbox Series X and S, and Nintendo Switch in Q4 this year. Spoiler, originally we were eyeing October, and then a certain Metroidvania game got announced.
Oops.
It's like, they haven't had one in 10 years, we're clear.
Now, I can imagine your reaction, like, now Nintendo? Now's the time?
And I remember watching that E3, and I was like, all right, as long as Hollow Knight doesn't come out, and it didn't, and then Nintendo's like, a surprise!
You're like, damn.
Yeah, all right then, I'm excited to play it. Anyway, yeah, we're coming out in Q4. There's going to be one major update later on, because we can't get the randomizer done for release time. We're not even trying to do that. It's going to be patched in later. Major content update's going to come, and we're going to roll it to PS4 and stuff like that later on. Big release is going to come out in Q4 though.